So now we're moving on to the larger and more broad aspects of ecology. We're going to look at ecosystem and biosphere level parts of ecology. So don't forget these are our key terms, and let's dive in. So when we talk about ecosystem ecology, we're looking at that ecosystem level where we are looking at interactions between the biotic and living components and the abiotic or non-living components and how those play into each other. So we're really looking a lot at this level at energy flow and nutrient cycling. And a couple things to remember as we move in to ecosystem ecology is that there's the laws of conservation of energy and matter. So we can't make matter or destroy it. We can't make energy or destroy it. And that all of the energy used by living things on the planet ultimately came from the sun. And I'll get a little bit more into that as we go, but basically the sun provides the energy for photosynthesis, and all other living things depend on photosynthetic organisms to survive. I just want to bring your attention for 1 second to this idea of a food web. In lower levels of school, you learned about food chains, and food webs are just basically slightly more complicated food chains where we're looking at who consumes who in an environment. What are those interactions? And so from here, we're going to build on this and look at energy flow. So we call these trophic levels or trophic structures. It's the position or the step that an organism will occupy within its food web, basically based on its source of energy and nutrients. That's supposed to say base, not case, sorry. And so we often display this as a pyramid. It's going to effectively show the energy flow very well. And within here, we are also cycling nutrients, which I'm going to get into. There's a piece of this pyramid that is kind of missing. It's a hidden secret piece that we'll talk about that gets into that nutrient cycling. But remember, this is all going to begin with the sun. The sun is the ultimate source of energy for all living things because it powers the process of photosynthesis, which creates the energy flow start point for living organisms. So let's go through the levels of these trophic structures. So first we have our producers. These are the organisms that are going to produce energy and create the food for the rest of the organisms on the planet from the sun. And we call that process photosynthesis. So this is going to be our largest group. It's the base of the pyramid. Everything else is going to build off of this. Then we have our primary consumers. So these are going to be the organisms that consume the producers. We call those herbivores. Then we have secondary consumers. These are organisms that can either consume the primary consumers, or some of them can even consume the producers. They can be carnivores or omnivores. And then we have at the very top our tertiary consumers. These are our apex predators. They're organisms that don't have predators of their own. They're most commonly carnivores. Some are omnivores, but they're going to have the lowest amount of energy as well as numbers, and I'll get into that in a moment. Now, hidden within this pyramid are a group called the decomposers or the detritivores. These are organisms that break down dead organisms and return their nutrients back into the soil. So here we're really looking at energy flow. However, at this same point, starting here with the producers, they will take up nutrients from the environment and feed nutrients into this pyramid as well. And those will also cycle from all of these organisms into the decomposers back into the soil, and then the producers will take them, or the soil, the atmosphere, whatever it might be, and then the producers will take those back up and feed them back into the cycle. Now, when we look at these trophic pyramids, we see that there's an energy loss at every single stage. And that's because no process is perfectly efficient. There will be energy loss at every stage, just like with things that you build in engineering. So for living organisms, our energy is going to be lost to a couple things. Well, we do something called metabolism. That is the process of our cells using energy to stay alive and to fight the effects of entropy, basically, which we'll get into in later units. So because we do metabolism, we're going to have to maintain stable internal conditions. That's homeostasis. We're going to have to fight diseases. We're going to have to move our organism around our individual body. We're going to have to heal damage, and all of that is going to take up some of the energy that we take in, and we will then release a lot of that energy back into the environment as heat. So some of the energy will remain in our bodies as physical calories that can be eaten by some other member within the pyramid, but the rest of it is not going to be usable because either we use that energy to survive and metabolize, or we lose it as heat. Now, when we look at this pyramid structure, it's a pyramid of energy, meaning the producers have the most energy, but it is also a pyramid of numbers and a pyramid of biomass. So not only do the producers have the most amount of energy available in that level, they have the highest number of individuals. They also have the most mass available. And that makes sense because we need this base to be strong because it has to feed every single level of this pyramid. The energy here gets passed on to the next level. That energy in that level gets passed on and so forth. And so this is where we see that we actually need this pyramid structure. If we had the top, the tertiary consumers, actually having more biomass and more individuals than our producers, this whole process, would be unsustainable. Kind of think of it as a power grid or like a multi-stage rocket. If you are passing only a small subset of your energy, like maybe 10% to the next stage, then how can you have a high amount of apex components, top components, apex predators, without having some kind of massive energy base as a support, because you're going to be losing energy along the way as you go. So we also have nutrient cycling. We call this biogeochemical cycling. So we are taking a chemical and we are cycling it through the living and the earth cycles. So it's allowing the reuse of limited nutrients since, there's conservation of mass and all of that. So this is usually going to involve a biotic and an abiotic component to the cycle. You've seen the water cycle before, but you may not have seen the carbon, nitrogen, and phosphorus cycles. With the carbon cycle, the living components are plants and animals. They can take CO2 out of the environment. Animals put it back into the environment, but we can also see that the soil is a sink. It stores carbon. The atmosphere also has carbon in it as well. We can do emissions. There's lots of things that are biological and abiotic as well. Same with the nitrogen cycle. So bacteria can actually take nitrogen that's in the air and turn it into a form that can be used by plants and animals. Also, lightning can do this, which is really cool. It can break apart the really strong bonds between the nitrogen atoms in the atmosphere and convert it into forms that are usable by living things. And as we use them, we also create some nitrogen that goes back out into the atmosphere. And then the phosphorus cycle, where we have phosphorus in organisms and it leaches into the soil when we die, and that goes into the abiotic component and cycles with weathering and rain and runoff and all of that. So that is the ecological or the ecosystem level of ecology that we just looked at. Now let's kind of shift our focus to more biosphere level or whole planet levels of discussions. And really this is going to focus on biodiversity. This is the variety of life in an area that is determined by the number of species or the variety in your genetics or the type of different ecosystems on the planet. Basically, the more species, the more differences in the quality and quantity of life on the planet, the more biodiverse everything will be. And biodiversity is a good thing. You want a lot of differences and you want a lot of options on your planet because it's just going to increase the health and stability of the biosphere and the ecosystem or your population, whatever it might be long term. So we're going to briefly look at 3 different types of biodiversity here. So at the population level, we're looking at genetic diversity. This is how different your genes are within a species, your DNA itself, your inheritable characteristics that you can pass on to your offspring. So the more differences in your genes, the more different kinds of traits you can pass on. So if humans only had brown eyes to pass on, that would be very low genetic diversity. But we have green, blue, brown, hazel, gray, all these different eye colors. That's a high genetic diversity for that gene. And you might think, why does that matter? Well, yeah, for eye color, it doesn't quite matter. But the more diversity in your genes, the better your chances of surviving. Let's say a disease comes through, and if your entire population responds to that disease in the same way, and you all die from it, that's a problem. Versus if you have a lot of genetic diversity, then different organisms can respond to different environmental signals in different ways. Sometimes we might die, sometimes we'll survive, and we'll help the species evolve, basically. So it helps us adapt to changing environmental conditions when we have a high genetic diversity. We'll get into this more when we talk about evolution as well. But a sad example, cheetahs have a very low genetic diversity. They are so genetically similar to each other that they're basically all siblings. And this is because of after the Ice Age, we had what's called a bottleneck. Their population just absolutely crashed in size. And so there's so few of them left that they can't get enough genetic diversity anymore. So if something were to happen, all of the cheetahs are in danger of going extinct at the same time. Then there is species diversity. This is where the number of different species is high or low in an area. We want it to be higher, so the relative abundance, the number of different types of organisms is a good thing. So we tend to see more species diversity near the equator just because there's more sunlight availability and more rainfall, which gives us more producers. The more producers you have, the more differences in the producers you have, the more types of consumers that your pyramid can sustain. So as you get closer to the poles, there's less sunlight, less precipitation, so we can't sustain as many producers, which means we can't sustain as many consumers. And there will be less species diversity as you go closer to the poles versus at the equator. So here's just a cool little infographic in case you did not know. This is the state of species biodiversity on the planet. So predominantly animals, then plants, for different types of species. And within the animals, the majority of different species are insects. And then if you take the ones that we're probably more familiar with, which are the vertebrates, it's just the small little slice, and more than half of those are fish. So kind of cool to see. Mammals make up a very small portion of the overall biodiversity on the planet. And then there's ecosystem or habitat diversity. This is the variety of different habitats or different ecosystems on the whole planet, on the biosphere. So this is going to be affected by the health of the area. The abiotic factors play a big role in this, such as climate. And we want to have lots of different types of ecosystems on a planet because it's going to buffer against biosphere level threats and changes like climate change or something like that. If everywhere was jungle, we would have a very hard time responding to any type of global level change. If everywhere was desert, same thing. So why does biodiversity matter? Lots of reasons. There's a lot of personal reasons. There's a lot of conservation reasons. There's a lot of reasons for protecting the planet and for maintaining overall health and integrity of the planet. There's reasons based in logic and emotion. So why should we encourage protection of biodiversity? Well, the first is there's a direct economic value to it, and this is probably the most nihilistic view here. We have a strong motivation to keep biodiversity up because we make money off of the products on the planet. The different types of foods, plants produce lots of different chemicals that become our pharmaceuticals or our antibiotics. So there is a direct economic value to biodiversity. And if you don't know, this is the seed vault in Svalbard. So deep in the mountains in the permafrost, they have tons of different seeds of different species of plants that can become food. That way, if there's some type of global catastrophe, we have the original seed bank to still pull from. And every single country on the planet, I believe even North Korea, has contributed something to this seed vault. Then there's indirect economic value, things like forests and plant material. They will create lots of strong roots that stabilize banks and prevent things like landslides and mudslides and all that kind of stuff. So that helps keep our human-built civilization more stable and less at threat from changes on the planet. Then there's aesthetic value. Nature is beautiful, and as humans, we actually have biological responses to the beauty of nature and to the fractal nature of the planet. The more indoor human-created spaces are quite boxy, and we lose fractalization. And there's a calming neurostimulative component that actually helps us regulate our nervous system better when we see lots of fractals around by being out in nature. And then, of course, scientific value. Humans are quite curious, and we can't really understand the planet if we're continually decreasing the biodiversity of the planet. So what are some threats to biodiversity? There's always threats. Some are man-made, some are natural. It's just a product of life. We're going to go through some of these right now, kind of just a brief little overview. The first, this is an anthropogenic threat, so a human-caused threat, and that's overexploitation. So when we excessively use organisms that have economic value, be they plants or animals, we start to decrease their numbers, which leads to a loss of biodiversity, genetic, individual, species, whatever that might be. So we can use organisms for food, for medicine, for their fur, for beauty as decoration, like orchids. We at one point were hunting orchids almost to extinction and taking them out of the jungle. And so many of them are quite rare now to find in the jungle because we took them all out, and they're very hard to propagate on our own outside of their natural habitat. This is an example of the early American plains. These are all buffalo skulls or bison skulls that were hunted basically nearly to extinction at the time because we were using them for their fur, for their food. We were also just doing it for fun. So this is an example of overexploitation. So habitat loss and habitat destruction are probably the biggest threats to biodiversity and to species right now. It's the number one driver of species extinction on the planet. So things like deforesting, clearing areas for crops, building cities, all of that destroys habitats. And it may not be complete destruction of the landscape, but any type of change that affects the balance of species can lead to overall destruction and loss of biodiversity in a habitat. Part of this habitat destruction also comes from something called habitat fragmentation. So maybe you don't destroy an entire habitat, but you fragment it by putting a road or something through it, or even a small little town. Now what you've done is you've affected the balance between the edges and the actual inner portion of this habitat. And the edges have very different results than the inner portion. So some organisms can only live on the edges of habitats. You'll have different effects from sunlight and from weather in the edges versus in the interior. And so as a result, you could end up with more and more fragmentation and more loss of those inner portions, and that's driving a lot of extinction right now, believe it or not. So we call those edge effects, different environmental factors that only occur on the edges of an ecosystem versus the interior. And it just prevents natural movement of species. That it makes their habitats smaller, which leads to more competition. So it's just a big issue overall. Then there is pollution, which changes what types of chemicals are found in the air, the soil, or the water. A big issue with pollution right now is eutrophication. This is a form of water pollution, often caused by fertilizer, where so much fertilizer runs off into bodies of water like ponds or lakes that there's an algal bloom. The algae get so many nutrients that they grow out of control. We have momentarily exponential growth, and it ends up using up all the oxygen in that body of water, killing off all the plants and animals in there. And then this entire area becomes a dead zone. Obviously, there's climate change. This is the long-standing prevailing weather of a region over a long period of time. And so this is going to obviously affect how organisms are able to survive and what organisms live in different areas. So climate change is this large-scale, long-term alteration to the Earth's climate. Could be natural or anthropogenic. There's aspects of both affecting climate change right now. And it's thought that climate change is one of the main drivers of risk after habitat destruction. And they're saying that climate change could cause 5 to 23% of the species on the Earth to go extinct in the next couple of decades. There are sources of carbon, so these are reservoirs that release carbon into the atmosphere. We often have this related to humans, so as we dig into the forests and deforest and dig into the dirt and rip up the roots, we will release a bunch of carbon into the atmosphere. Volcanoes do this, land disturbances, all of that. And then there's carbon sinks. These are natural reservoirs that remove carbon from the atmosphere and sequester it. Big one is going to be grasslands, oceans, marshlands, wetlands, things like that. And just in case you guys don't know what this term is, extinction is when the last member of a species dies and that species is no longer found in the biosphere. Sometimes we call species extinct if there's so few left that they never can repopulate the Earth at decent numbers. So this can be natural, it can be man-made, it just depends. So that is it. We're going to take all of these things that we've learned in the past 2 videos and do deeper dives into them in class. We'll do some practice problems, we'll make some more connections to engineering, and just kind of solidify these ideas together. So I hope that helped, and I will see you on Friday.